This video I'm going to go through tables and how to customize the look and feel of them. So I have a table in here. It has a table heading, then it has the table body, and that's made up of a couple of columns. And at any of those intersection points between columns and the rows in the heading and the body are cells. I have a table title up across the top, and if I open up the paragraph designer, you can see that I have a paragraph tag called table title. And I have these paragraphs, which are cell headings, and these paragraphs, which are set up as cell body. There's also the table designer, and that can be opened up in a couple of different ways. I can go through, I can use the keyboard shortcut Control-T, which is also shown if I choose table format. The table designer acts sort of like the paragraph designer for paragraphs, except that, of course, it's for tables. It displays the name of the current table, format A, and in the drop-down, if I had others, I would see the names of those. And then I have a set of tabs. So the first tab is the basic properties. The second one is the ruling, the lines around the table. Third one is the shading, which would be the background shading for things like the heading or the body. And then the last one is the direction for multilingual support. I'm going to go into the basic properties and make a couple of changes, but in order to really show you the impact, I'm going to go and do a few view-related changes. I'm going to come in first, and under the view, I'm going to turn off the borders, and under view, turn off the text symbols. That just gives you a little bit of a better idea of what the table might look like when it prints. And just for convenience sake, I'm going to take this chunk of content and copy it. And when I paste it right over top, I'm going to insert above the current rows. So the table is large enough that it starts to fill up the first page. It's almost filling the entire page, but not quite. So I'll do one more copy and paste so that it continues on to the next page. And then you'll start to see some interesting stuff happen. On the next page, the bottom of the table has a ruling that runs all the way across it, but on the previous page where the table continues, that line is not visible at the bottom. I'll show you how to change that. In addition, the table is currently lined up right against the margin, and if I come in and I take the table and I just resize it a little bit so that you can see a few more changes, I could take a table and set it up to do a couple of different things. So I can align it so that it's on the left or the right side, and when I update all, the tables redefine themselves. I change that from right to center. Once more, update all. And there's an interesting option in here where you can set it up to be on the side closer or farther from the binding. So imagine if you had a 3-hole punch running down the middle, you could set tables so that instead of the left or the right, they are closer to where the 3-hole punch is, or they are farther from where that 3-hole punch is. So they're farther from the binding, or they're set up closer to the binding. And it'll look almost like they jump left, right when you're working with a double-sided page. I'm going to go in and just use the undo in order to put the table back to sort of what I had earlier, and it's now sized so that it's back to the defaults. The table title, if I want to change the appearance of it, is done through the paragraph designer. So I can come in, change the look of this, and decide that I make it a little smaller. I'll make it 9 point and update all. Just remove overrides to make everything consistent. And I'll take the element and purpose information that's here and make it bold and get rid of the italic. So regular, bold, and this is for the cell heading, and I update all. And lastly, the cell body, which is currently Minion Pro and 9 point, I'll change that to be Myriad Pro, and I'll leave it at 9 and update all, and you can see the change in the document. So the paragraph designer works in conjunction with the table designer. The table designer is the look and feel of the overall structure of the table. The paragraph designer and, of course, the character designer control content in the table. I'm going to take the table and make a couple more changes. Just make it a little narrower for a moment, and then I'm going to choose View and turn on the borders just for a bit. If I give the table an indent, let's say 1/2 inch, and I update all, you'll see the table's pushed over about 1/2 inch from the margin. The table title is not. It's a unique paragraph, so you can decide that you want to indent that also 1/2 inch, and you do it through the paragraph designer. All my tables, because they're all set up with format A, have the same look and feel, and they're now indented. So some of them actually end up running off of the text frame area, and I could go through and start to resize them. Your best bet is to set up your table configuration early before you create a bunch of tables. Otherwise, you spend time resizing. And then after you've done all of that, if you decided to change the left margin to 1/4 inch and update all, you may find yourself going back and taking the table yet again and resizing it. So I'll set up the table with a 0 margin, update all, and I'll just resize these couple of tables pretty quickly so that I'm back to what I started with. You could also do a right indent. If you set up the table to be right aligned instead of left aligned, you can push it away from the right margin. You can change the space above the table. If you take a look, you'll see the top of the table is the title right now, and the gap between the top of this and where it reads user interface domain elements, or the top of this table where it reads task domain and this text on task domain elements, that gap is controlled by the space above the table, and then there's also a space below. So if I change the space above to, let's do 6 points, and change the space below to 20, and I update all, you'll see that the tables are now pulled a little closer to the text above, and they push the content below a little further. And I could go further with that and say 0 and 36. And now the text is as close as it can be to the line above it, and it has a much larger gap below. Once more, I'll put those back to 12 and 12 and update all. When you're working with a table, I've just scrolled up, but when you're working with a table, you also have the cell margins. And I'll increase these values so that it's double what we currently have. So 8 for the top, 4 for the bottom, 8 for the left and right, and update all. Watch in the table in a moment the distance between the top and left and bottom and right of the border of the cells and the content that's in it. So here we go with update all. That now leaves a larger blank space around these. And if I go in under view and I turn off the borders, you'll see that it looks like there's a bigger gap between cells. Again, dropping that down to half of its values, 4, 2, 4, and 4, and I'm just tabbing between these and update all. Tightens up the table. I can also change the table position for the title so that it's below the table, and if I update all, it appears underneath. You can see table 1 is at the bottom of this page. I could set it for no title, which would delete them. I'm not going to do that. I'll just put it back above and update all. I mentioned the idea of aligning them. You can also set the start position so that tables start at the top of columns or left or right pages. There's also an option for float, which basically takes the table and says, look, move it around a little bit if you have to, so that the table starts on the page or as close to it as possible. It's one that you'll see more often if you do a bunch of design work and you play with it to really see what the impact is across multiple columns. Sometimes you'll have a table in the first column and it'll float and appear in the second in order to just try to keep the content looking a little cleaner. The numbering of the table is an interesting one. Let me actually highlight some content in here. So I've got a couple of paragraphs, and I'm going to go in and apply the number continue to these. So I get a 4, and next to it is a 5, I get a 6, next to it is a 7, I get an 8, next to it is a 9. So somewhere in the document I have a 1, 2, 3. But I'm going to go in here and change the number so that instead of row first, it's column first, and update all. And watch what happens to the 4 with the 5 next to it, the 6 with the 7 next to it. It now numbers by column first. So it numbers down 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then across and 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Again, I'll change that back to row first, update all, and I'm going to take all of the content that's in here and reformat it. I'm using function 9, by the way, as the keyboard shortcut to access paragraph formats. I'm going to make these into cell body and reset it. So that gives you an idea of most of the settings. The gap is the space between the bottom of the title and the top of the table itself. So if I take the gap, and again, I'll make it really noticeable, I'll go to 36 and update all. You can see that it's put a much larger gap between the table title and the table itself. I'll put that back down to a 6. Last one in here is the Orphan Rose, and that basically decides how many minimum rows need to go to the next page if it splits. So the table will split if there's enough to put 3 on the first and second page. If I set this orphan row higher to something like 8 and I do an update all, I may end up with the entire table or parts of the table bouncing across to the next. So you can see here 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces jump to the next page. If I drop my orphan rows down to 2 and I update all, I could be in a situation where the table is small enough that only 2 go to the next page. But it'll just ensure that you don't end up with a table that has just a single chunk of information. So for argument's sake, element purpose, and then win title, and use to mark up names of windows or dialogues, and that's it. I'll put it back to the 3 that it had earlier and update all. So that takes you through the first tab of the table designer. The second one deals with shading and ruling types of properties, second and third. So I'll start off with the second one, which is the ruling, and you'll see a bunch of changes inside the table as I start to add content. I'm going to temporarily turn on my borders, and then I'll just enter a little bit so that I have a heading that has multiple rows inside of it, and then I have a body that has multiple rows. You can see that between the heading and the body, there is a thin line that runs all the way across. That is the separator between the heading and the footing. So if I change that to a double line and I update all, you'll see that a double line now appears above the body and below the heading. And because I used update all and everything in here is a format A, when I scroll down to another table, the same pattern repeats itself. I can also set up the divider between the rows inside the heading. So to make it visible again, I'll use a thick line and use update all, and you can see exactly which lines changed, only the ones that are in the heading. Here I'm into the body. The body uses these settings. So the first, second, third is none, all others are none. Every second is none, all others are none. And you can see with the visual graphic that it's going to be the lines that divide the columns for the first one and the lines that define the rows in the second. So if I set it up so that every third is set up to be thick and I update all, you can see that it has 1, 2, 3, a thick line. 1, 2, 3, a thick line. If I scroll down, this one gets a little weird because it's at the bottom of the page and it doesn't show the line at the bottom. If I change from every third to every fifth and I update all, you'll see the lines jump around a bit, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the thick line. I'm going to go in and make a couple of other changes here. If I had the table set up with multiple columns, here I only have 2, but if I had multiple columns, I could decide that the first or the second or the 10th is set up with a specific style, and all others have a different style. That's something that you can play around with. Any table that you create gives you the opportunity to try this. And then the outside ruling. Right now there's a thin line around the outside. And again, if you look at the bottom of the table, and I'm going to scroll so that you can see the bottom of this table on the first page, which is page number 67, but it's the first of 3 pages. And then you can also see it onto the next page. If I go in and I turn off draw bottom ruling and I update all, it draws a solid line across the bottom here. And if I come along and I just put that check mark back on and I update all, the line vanishes. So that'll decide what happens visually if the table splits across 2 pages. I'm going to go in, under View, turn off my borders, and I'm just going to tweak a couple of these settings so that it looks a little better. The first is none. Every fifth is set to none for my column and rows. That cleans those up a little. Maybe I'll do every third is set up with a thin line. And that makes it kind of interesting to identify information. I like this if I have a large table, especially if there's one that's on a rotated page. But if I have a large table, it's easy to say, moving across, this information, especially if I have multiple columns, is below the line. This is nowhere near the line, and this is above it. It makes it really easy to visually guide yourself across, especially if you have a very data-intense type of table content. I'm going to move on. Separators. I'll leave it with a double line. I'm going to change this to none. Update all. Take a look at it. I can delete these pieces that I don't actually need. So I'll just highlight, delete, and remove. That pulls it up. You can still see there's no line at the bottom because the draw bottom ruling was off or on. Also going to set it up so that, yes, my separator is a line, but I'll make it a thick line. And outside, I'm going to do a double line. Now I'm just pressing Tab and D for double. Tab, D for double, and Tab, D for double. Update all. So I end up with a solid line between the heading and the body. I end up with every third has a line. and around the outside I have a double line. So if I scroll down, you'll see that pattern into subsequent tables. Smaller tables, this might not look great because I end up with a line in here that doesn't really seem to add any value. Here I've only got 3 pieces, so I don't get the every third. The outside ruling basically wins, if you will. If there's a conflict, the outside ruling appears first, and if there is no outside ruling, it would end up putting a line potentially in that situation. Again, taking a look in this first table, I've gone in, I've made a couple of changes, and this is all based on format A. I'm going to go over to the shading. Here's an interesting one that people ask for. They want to be able to take the title and set it up so that it looks basically exactly like what I've just highlighted. They want to have a black background or a very dark background and then have white lettering over top of it. So let's set it up. The heading and the footing, I'm going to fill it with, I'll do 50% black for now. Update all, and you can see it gives it a dark gray background. The problem is that this text doesn't change, the word element and the word purpose. If I go to an even darker background, let's say I go to 90% and I update all, it is now almost impossible to read the words in here. If I zoom in and you look really carefully and you've got your contrast set up, you might be able to see the word purpose right here. But it's tough to read. Remember though, that's part of a paragraph, the cell heading. So if I go to the paragraph and I change the color of this to be white and I update all, I now have a reversed white text on a black background. And if you scroll through, you'll see that in all the tables. That can look pretty sharp depending on what it is that you're going for. I'm going to go in though and change the paragraph though. So I click up inside the cell heading. I'm going to change the color back to black, update all. And I'll go to my table designer so that the overall look of the table just has a 10% black background. So it gives it a light gray shade. If I go with a really solid black background, I run the possibility that if somebody's printing this, they're going to go through a decent amount of toner every time they hit one of those tables. And if I have a lot of tables, it ends up just using a lot of black toner ink. I can also shade the body or the columns. So if I shade the columns and I decide that the first one is going to be filled in with 30% and the color is yellow, I update all. I have the next one not doing anything. So it just repeats all the way through. But if I do the next one with a different combination, let's say 70% gray, update all. Now I have the pattern of the first one, the next one, and that pattern repeats. It's easier to see though if I change it to the body rows and then update all. Now I've got the first one, the next one, and then that pattern alternates. I could change it from first one to first two, update all. Or if I wanted to, I could do something like this. First three, next three. I'm just using tab to navigate through here. And because I also have my line set up for every third, it actually gives it a really nice little block for all of the content. So by going in and working with a combination of the shading, ruling, and the basic properties, I can drive the appearance of the table. If I then also wanted to, I can use the paragraph designer in order to change the appearance of text that is inside the table. That gives you an idea of how to design a table. One more thing that I want to look at, and that's this idea. I want to go in and build a custom table. So I may look at a table and say, this is kind of close to what I already want. I'm going to take the element and copy and paste it to the left. I'll resize these two pieces, so I'm highlighting both and resizing them. I'll take purpose and size it down as well, and for convenience sake, I'm going to view my borders. So I size that right to the margin. This is now a 3 column. I'm going to set up the size of the table as well. So what I'm doing here is I'm deleting several cells so that I'm down to a table that has one heading, one body, and it has 3 columns inside of it. At this point, I've defined the size of the table exactly the way that I want it to appear, and I choose Command's new format. And lacking creativity, I'll call it 3 column, and I put it into the catalog. This is now a table called 3 column. The table under it is still a Format A, as is the table above it. So this table, the 3-column table, I click once anywhere inside it. So I'll just click in the word element in the second column, and I'm going to change around some of the properties. I'm going to take this table and decide that the title appears below. After the table, I want a much more noticeable gap, 36 points. I want the table to be set up so that it has around the outside a thick line. So I'm just using my tab key to work through thick, update all. That's a thick line around it. I'm going to set it up so that there is a thin line for the separator. And all of these lines I'm going to set to none, so I'm just tabbing over and using N for none and update all. Lastly, I'll go to the color settings, and for the heading and the footing, I'll set that up to be 50%. I'm going to change the color on it to be green. And the body row, I'm going to do something kind of cool. I'm going to set the first 3, or the first 1, or the first 20, whatever it might be, to be 100%. And for the color, I'm going to go with pale green. So I'm going to set it to be 100% pale green, followed by the next 3 also being 100% pale green. In other words, everything will be pale green except for the heading. So now it's set up. It's got a little bit of a look and feel to it. If I add to the table, you can see that that pattern just continues. Watch what I'm going to do next, because this is kind of a big deal. I take the table, I size the table, I add whatever number of columns and rows that I want, I remove information or I add information inside the table. So this now has 1 in the heading, it has 2, 4, 5 into the body, it is 3 columns. You can see the width of each of the columns, and I click Update All. What it's just done is taken a snapshot of a 3-column table, and this will now be the rule for a 3-column table. So if I come along in my document to an earlier location or a later location, and I choose under Table to Insert, I have the option for a 3-column, which is 3 columns, 5 body rows, 1 heading, no footing. Or if I change this to a Format A, the numbers change to be 2 and 13 and 1 and 0. And the reason it has 13 is that at some point I clicked inside this table and I chose Update All, and it did a snapshot. So if I realize that that table is too large, I can find a smaller table. This one here has 1, 3, and 2 columns. So I click in it and I choose Update All. That's it. I build a table, format it, configure the size, the number of columns and rows, the heading, the footing, click in it once, update all. And now, I'll just scroll upwards, but now I come along, I click, I choose Table Insert, 3-column, and watch what happens to the Format A. It's knocked it down, and it's made it much smaller, 3, 5, 1, and 0. I'll cancel that, and I'm going to go back to my 3-column and make 1 or 2 more changes in here. I'm going to take this middle column and make it narrower. I'll take this first column and make it wider. I'll just delete some of the sample text that I have in here. So I'm going to leave the cells empty so that I can take a look at it and say, yeah, that's what I want. I want this middle column to be thin. If you look in the bottom left of my screen, the width is decimal 0.625. If I highlight this first column and I hover and I click, it says the width is 1.25. So that's my 3-column. I'll just get rid of a couple of extra pieces in here. I'll remove those cells, and I'm left with a table that's pretty small. It's 3-column, it has 1 in the heading, it has 2 into the body. Update all. The snapshot doesn't just remember the numbers, it also remembers the dimensions. So I like scrolling up to the top so that you can see exactly what you get here. Table Insert, I'm going to use the 3-column and insert it. And notice the width of this. It's exactly what I had previously defined. If I hover over this and I click, you can see the width is 0.625. I'm just going to delete that. I look at my table and I say, you know what? I want this to actually be larger. So I highlight. This time I'm using Shift as I click and drag so that the middle becomes quite noticeably wider and the end of it becomes pretty narrow. And I'm also going to just add a little bit to the table so that it has 4. I click Update All. I've just done a snapshot. I captured the properties of this table, and when I go to insert it inside the document, what I'm going to see is that it's 3-column, it has 4 body rows, and as soon as I click Insert, it's inserted, and you can see the width of this column. The width of it is automatically set to be much wider. So the trick with table design is to go in and build tables that look exactly the way you want them to, and once they are at that point, click Update All. If you're adding new tables, you build it, you start to configure it, and you use your Command New Format, it will do an immediate snapshot of whatever you name it and whatever you've currently got it configured to be. So set up your tables, test your tables, insert them. If you don't like the look, tweak the table, come back to it, change it around a little bit, delete, add, modify some of the information that's inside the table, update all to take the snapshot, and then you can come along and insert whenever you feel like it. There it is. As a recap, I come along and I need to work with a table. I choose Table Insert. I select Format A or B or 3-column or 2-column or whatever it's named. I look at the values that are inside the top of this for the column, body, row, heading, and footing. It's based on the snapshot. I decide if I do or do not want these variables. I insert the table. This is my Format A. If I want to build a table, I like to go in, set up the number of columns and rows right at the beginning. Once I have that defined, I choose Command's New Format. I name it, I create it, and then I further configure it using the Table Designer properties. And once I've gone through and I've decided what I want this to appear as, I do an Update All. That then captures the information for the future when I come along and I insert a table using Format A, B, or the one where I just went in to name it a moment ago, which happens to look exactly like a Format A until I tweak. I tweak the basic properties by putting the title above or below. I tweak it by giving it an alignment that's centered. Now this table is not the right size to be centered, so I resize it. Now you can see the centering effect. I'm going to take my left indent or my right indent and change it. I'm going to take my space above or my space below and change it. Let's put 48 below. I'm going to change my cell margins. I'll give it 12, 8, 12, and 12. Lots of space around everything. Update all. You can definitely see that this table's changed. I go in, I change my ruling. I go in and I change my color. Color is noticeable, so I'll make it columns. I'll do the first one is going to be 3% blue. Update all. Next one is going to be 10% red. Update all. I change it from columns to rows. I update all. I add to the table. Update all. And what I've done along the way is I've redefined the table. When I went in to name it, I've now used the update all. And again, I insert a table based on any one of these formats. And I get my 3-column. Or if I delete it and I insert my Format A, or I delete it and I insert the one where I had to name it. And in all cases, the table has a set of pre-configured properties that make it very quick, very easy to insert the table after you've spent time with the Table Designer configuring the table.